Hi, Frans.
Greg, how are you?
I'm very good, thanks. And yourself?
Excellent, thank you.
Cool. I'm very excited to be here with you again, doing our third video now. I think the last two have been a great success, and yeah, I'm looking forward to diving into chapter 2 today of your book, South Africa Can Work. If this is the first video that anyone's watching, if this is your first video in the series of videos that we're making. So Frans is the author of South Africa Can Work, a book about how a free market and a decentralized government can make South Africa a winning nation. And in today's episode, we are diving into chapter 2, which is titled "Let's Be Honest About White Privilege," which is quite a exciting topic and something I've been looking forward to discussing with you, Frans. I know in our last video we talked a bit about white privilege, but it was more focused on the general issue of race. And I'm looking forward to this discussion. I think it's going to be a lot more focused than the last one. So to kick it off, why don't we start with how the chapter begins, with a story about a lawyer.
Yes.
Can you get us going?
Yes, I have a friend, Richard Spoor, who's probably one of the more well-known human rights lawyers in South Africa. In particular, someone I knew from the early days of the struggle, when he briefed me to defend petrol bomb throwers and alleged terrorists and all sorts of people, and I mostly had to do bail applications at the beginning and later on criminal trials and so on. And we became reasonably good friends. We then lost contact, and he ended up in Mpumalanga, where he is now a lawyer engaged in class actions. And the particular class action that kicked off the story was one where the workers in the mines had contracted silicosis, which is a very serious disease which you get from working underground in certain circumstances. And he was keen to help them, and he got funding eventually, and it was a massive case. And part of the case involved an application that had to be done in the High Court. And shortly before the High Court application in Johannesburg, the Black Lawyers Association in Johannesburg got wind of the fact that he had not briefed a single black advocate in his matter.
Right.
And they called him out on this on Facebook and on social media. Said, "Why don't you have any black advocates?" And his response was, "Well, first of all, I have to get the very best. It's a really critical part of a case and a very important part of a case. And I have inquired, and those advocates, those black advocates who would fit the bill, who would be critically skillful enough to handle this case on behalf of all these hapless black workers, were otherwise engaged. I simply couldn't get the people I needed, and I eventually ended up getting only white advocates," which sounded like a perfectly good explanation at the time, but caused an absolute furore on the social media pages. So much so that on the day in question, he was called effectively in to confront, that was now in court, an en masse appearance of members of the Black Lawyers Association who stood up and spoke with the permission of the court, and basically together with his colleagues, even the colleagues on the same side of the case, condemning him and having a regular old feeding fest of righteous indignation. And I found that to be quite distasteful at the time.
Right.
What upset me about it was that our system is geared, as it presently stands, towards affirmative action, which means that also at the bar, people must be briefed according to skin color as far as possible. You must brief people with the employment equity or affirmative action object in mind. So you have to have a certain demographic representation in your teams, and the purpose of that is to ensure that black advocates get exposure and become drawn into the briefing pattern. And that is true of every sphere of life. Universities, university admission, medical admissions, medical studies, employment generally, empowerment in the shareholding fields, and so on.
Yeah.
Which is fine, but it always acknowledges that those people who are benefited, who get the benefit, are disadvantaged because of historical disadvantage. They are less skillful. Otherwise, if they had been as skillful as the white advocates or whatever the case may be, they would have got the briefs, they would have got the instructions. But they are not. Now, the outrage, from my point of view, was the fact that people said to Spoor, but are you saying the black advocates are not as good as the whites? But these are the same people who say you have to brief people because they previously disadvantaged precisely because they are not as good as the whites yet.
Right.
And you understand that inherent contradiction.
Contradictory ideas
and
there.
That frustrated me beyond. In fact, it outraged me because I felt it was bitterly unfair.
Can you just repeat that again, just so that everyone's clear on that? So So on the one hand, they were saying, as they always do, that you have to brief the previously disadvantaged because they are previously disadvantaged. Therefore, they must get special preferential briefing. Or other treatment as the scenario changes. Which people, whether they like it or not, seem to agree with. I mean, it's
that
kind of
seems to be the mainstream approach, and it certainly must be the approach of the Black Lawyers Association.
Right.
And yet, when Richard Spoor pointed out that in this particular case he wanted the very best, and he couldn't find those people amongst the black advocates because of availability, what I call in the book the almost Kafkaesque outrage was, but are you saying the black advocates is not as good as the whites?
Right.
To which my response is, but what did you expect? We have had 350 years of disadvantage. We acknowledge the disadvantage.
Right.
We have, well, some of us, our government has certainly said, we must give preferential treatment to those people precisely because they are behind in the race, they are disadvantaged. And yet, you blame him for saying, but those that I could access were not quite as good yet. And I couldn't brief them for that reason. And that I find intellectually terribly dishonest. It is not right. You can't say both of those things in one argument.
I think it's such an interesting idea that there's this elephant in the room, these 350 years of oppression, the obvious disadvantage, and yet an attempt almost to kind of deny that or pretend that it isn't that way and kind of create this sort of false sense of equality and then target people when they undermine the hallucination or the illusion or delusion. It's a fascinating thing.
Yeah, we saw it in action in this week's the last 2 weeks' debates about our sports teams again.
Right.
It started with what we touched on in the last discussion, the Ashwin Willemse incident, which turned out now, funnily enough, from all reports, not to have had a racial implication. But be that as it may, that sparked off the debate about quotas again.
Right.
And we have this debate all the time about our Springbok team, which is said not to contain, either it doesn't contain enough black people, and if they are elected on the basis of black status, then white people are saying, well, they're probably not as good as the white players because they're quota players. They were picked precisely because they are black, which creates that tension, and of course places enormous stress on the relationship, because that stigma simply doesn't disappear. That's the terrible insult that it contains. Inherent in the system is that insulting statement which says, I will pick you because of the color of your skin.
Right.
And I just don't see how black sportsmen, for example, put up with it. I think it's undignified.
Something that I think is an important point to make is I'd like to bring up the issue of making wrong connections between ideas. So I think one of the problems is that whenever someone criticizes the quota system or affirmative action, people make these bizarre connections between the disagreement and racism or intolerance and my frustration is that that's not true. That we of course we want to see black sportsmen thrive. Of course we want to see a black Springbok captain. Just because we are opposed to the quota system doesn't mean that we don't want to see black people succeeding.
Well,
it's not the same thing.
That's the frustration, and that's why the chapter is called "Let's be honest about white privilege."
Right.
And the starting point for that honesty is the point to acknowledge that historically the blacks are behind in the race, white people are ahead in the race. It's simply a fact of life.
And if you can't,
this is where we are.
Yeah. And I feel like if you can't hold that fact with a certain degree of strength and kind of courage, it's going to be very difficult for you to negotiate your way through life, because you'll encounter problems and you won't be able to understand them or deal with them emotionally, because you haven't acknowledged the most basic fundamental truth that there's this incredible divide.
Yes.
And it's like, I'm sure any psychologist would say the first step in dealing with the problem is first, identifying it and acknowledging it, and then trying to figure out, okay, how do we address the problem?
Yes, well, Freud used to say you must go to that part of your soul of which you are most scared. That dark part that you don't want to confront. And I know I can't say to people how they should behave. I mean, I come back to that. I always land up with this dilemma, but I'm involved in this discussion.
Right.
Like Richard Spoor, who was white, I am also white, and I am part of this historical discussion, which is conducted in an attempt to resolve the issue.
Right.
And it has become so bad that people like me are often told, but we don't want to hear what you have to say. You have no role in this discussion. And I find that, to put it mildly, terribly frustrating. You run out of alternatives. You see, if I am part of the problem.
Right.
We must be honest about white privilege. That's the elephant in the room, supposedly.
You know what it makes me think of? For example, it's like there's something very off-putting about the sort of the vitriol aimed at men from extreme feminists, because my idea, my response is usually, if men are causing these problems that you're claiming they are, surely you should be engaging with them or trying to work with them. Why? It's like trying to tame a lion by stoking it or like poking it with a stick. I mean, you're never gonna get anywhere.
The other thing to say is that it's a relationship problem. it's about two groups, ostensibly. I mean, we have defined ourselves into groups now. So
Right.
that is, we're so far down that road that it's going to be really difficult to extricate ourselves from that fact.
Right.
So let's accept for the moment we have these two groups. And the problem is these two groups are not getting along, ostensibly.
Right.
I personally, of course, think that for 90% of the time they get along famously.
Right.
But not if you look at social media and the newspapers and radio and TV. Then you will think, well, they're surely having a big old fight all the time.
Yeah.
And it's because the chattering classes, as they are called, on both sides engage in this battle. And I think you can't address a relationship like that unless you say, well, let's at least have a stab at resolving it. I don't think we're going to resolve it by talking, but we can at least make a start.
And we can open people's minds up to, alternative possibilities and ideas.
Yeah, ultimately, of course, I say that it is an economic problem, but in order to get from here to there, we have to create room for trying out alternatives.
Right.
To the economic recipe, which has so far driven the races apart, as far as I can tell.
So maybe that's a good place to establish. You write here, it is important to understand why white privilege is a problem. So maybe it's a good time now to understand why white privilege is a problem. Can you help us explain?
Well,
help us understand.
I'm sitting with this dilemma that I can only respond to what I see, but I've really tried to talk to people, and I've tried to read what I can find, and it seems to me that what we must acknowledge is that there is a structural divide, a chasm that goes back a long way. The history is different. Let's go way back to the 10,000 years ago when the races took shape, as it were, through evolution. The one lot in Mesopotamia and Europe, and the other lot in Africa. And it just so happened that the one lot became technologically more advanced. They met in the southern tip of Africa and other places. And already there was potential for a big fight. Now, what then happened is that structural divide was continued and in some ways exacerbated because of the oppression. White people mainly, I think one of the main things was that white people had superior education for hundreds and hundreds of years, whilst black people would denied it. Now that must make a difference because it has a difference in terms of how you perceive yourself, your ability to communicate, to discuss the problem, and most fundamentally to make your way in the economic world. Everything underlined the difference between the two parties from that point of view. And I believe that played a huge role in driving the parties apart. And it goes really deep, because what you now find is that it is a structural divide that has resulted in a perception. A massive perception and experience problem on both sides. Which goes to things like property, like networks, powerful networks, and most fundamentally,
education as well.
And what has dawned on me most recently was that idea that we, and I've readily confessed to this, that we all have our prejudices, and we have, and the most dangerous ones are the ones which are almost involuntary, where you realize that you've done something that is hurtful because you made certain assumptions based on those structural divisions.
Right.
And I can understand that causes major hurt. So from my point of view, I see the distinction. One example is this this thing of trust. You know, how many times I walk into a situation where I'm the only white person and there's a credibility issue or there's a trust issue to be resolved. And the instinctive response of everybody there, including and in particular the black person, the black security guard or the black policeman or the black manager, is, Mr. Rautenbach is here, he will tell us what really happened.
Right.
You know, we can rely on what he says.
Right.
And that implicit benefit of whiteness, I believe in. And I part ways, I think, with some of the right-wingers and some of my fellow libertarians, maybe even, in that respect. I think that is so. It is a fact of life, and it is a divisive fact.
There's very real advantages to being...
There are absolute advantages. And, you know, I've experienced it in small ways on the other side. When I arrived at the bar in Johannesburg, the Jewish advocates were miles ahead of us. For one reason mainly, and that is because they had wealthy family. They had wealthy attorneys as relatives, and they had relatives who were in business. Right. And some of those poor chaps had so much work, they were supported to such an extent that they could almost not handle the pressure.
Wow.
So bad was it. Whereas I had none of that. I was an Afrikaans-speaking junior advocate in Johannesburg, which was mainly English-speaking in the business circles. And I had to make it to that extent, to some degree, on my own. And I really found that I experienced that distinction. I didn't feel like a victim as a result of it. I just said, this is what I'm up against. I better work a little harder, you know, take a little bit more trouble. But I found that experience to be quite a daunting one, as a relative outsider, only marginally. So
you're saying that this insight is giving you a glimpse into what it may be like on a more extreme level.
Absolutely. There's just another story which I tell in the book on a completely different level. Many years ago, it turned out that my bar career was then not so unsuccessful after all. So after about 10 years, I decided I'm now wealthy enough to want to buy a small bushveld farm. Very ambitious. So I drove up to Hoedspruit in the Mpumalanga, I think it's Limpopo, in fact, just next to the Kruger Park, and I wanted to find a place to sleep one night, and I just followed my nose, and I drove along this dirt road which went straight into the bush, and it was dark. Both sides of the road was just bush extending for as far as you can see, not a light in sight, and straight road and game fences on both sides, wild country. I just travelled about 20 or 30 minutes, and eventually I saw this little light in the distance, and I approached, and there was a very sexy little thatched entranceway to the game reserve, to a particular private game reserve. And I stopped there, and the guard came out with his smart khaki uniform. So I said, "Do you have a place where I can sleep tonight?" And he looked at me sympathetically and said, "Sorry, sir, this is for members only." And I sat there in that dark bush, and I suddenly, for a moment, experienced what it's like to be the outsider. Just a tiny little glimpse, and I turned around and I left. So the point I'm making...
To not have access.
Not to have access. And that's not an access which is denied to me by some malevolent dictator of a government. It's a private system which I support at work. But I just happened to be at the wrong end of it that night.
Right.
And I didn't enjoy the moment. And I can understand if that is the experience of your life. I'm not talking about legal restrictions. I'm just simply talking about literally, you can't go into a restaurant. I had just recently, you have a black student for dinner or for lunch, I invite him, and it goes without saying, we're going to have lunch.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, he enthusiastically agrees. And when we get to order, he orders a coffee. And I can't understand it. I said, "So what's wrong?" He says, "No, this place is very expensive." And I just, had this twist of sympathy. And I thought, oh my goodness, he doesn't understand. I'm going to pay for him, And then suddenly the ice is broken. But if you come from an economically disadvantaged background, that sort of issue confronts you all the time. And you hear that. Right. Students at UCT will tell you all the time.
Right.
So yes, those problems exist.
So I have a question for you, but before I ask you that question, I just want to kind of make sure that I, as a sort of representative of the audience at home, understand exactly what you're talking about when you talk about white privilege.
Are you saying I haven't explained it properly?
No, I think you've explained it very well.
No, joking.
I get what I'm referring to there are the things you've written in the book which add to it. So maybe I can just read them. So you say, as I understand it, white privilege results from the reality that white people, for reasons in some respects going back millennia, have developed on the whole better schooling, better intellectual skills, more effective social networks, and of course more wealth in the form of fixed property. So you've mentioned better, more access.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to make sure that we understand this privilege that we enjoy.
It is a deep-seated privilege, and it's a privilege which goes to material things. First of all, it has to do with your ability to marshal material resources, money, capital. It has to do with the ability to call on your networks, your family and people like that, your relatives, your friends, people who will support you unquestioningly.
Right.
And not because of this or that, but just because they know you. They don't particularly think it's because you're white, but it so happens that is the circle in which you find yourself.
Right.
And that's a privileged one. And then it has to do with this unspoken benefit of assumptions that are made. If you want a lawyer, if you really want a lawyer, you see, and that's the tension with this professional incident that I spoke about. If you want a lawyer, the instinctive thing is to say, maybe the white guy will be better. It's terribly unjust when it comes to an individual.
Right.
It's terribly unfair. But there are those assumptions. So on all those levels, you have an advantage.
Right. So Frans, I've as a young South African with friends that were very involved in Roads Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, as someone who's experienced firsthand very intense confrontations between people, people confronting me about the issue of white privilege. Just a little story from my side. My first experience with white privilege was on Facebook. It was years ago, just after Daniel and I had matriculated. And Daniel actually has the same story. I shared on Facebook, a video of a white homeless man. And it was a guy in Rautenbach, this homeless guy in Rautenbach. And I shared the story, and I think I said something like, "Oh wow, very interesting story about this guy's life." And people just went for me, and people started calling me out and saying how it was very, basically how it was wrong of me to share this video when I never shared videos of other black homeless people. I mean, my initial response was, well, I haven't really seen a video of a black homeless person before. If I'd seen it, I would have shared it, I suppose. And anyway, so my response was, hold on, guys, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This isn't about race. And then I remember someone commented and said, "That's your white privilege. It's not about race." And ever since that interaction on Facebook, and then Daniel was involved in the discussion as well. Daniel is Francis' son. So Daniel was involved in that discussion as well. We kind of had the same experience of that moment being the sort of turning point, for better or for worse. And so ever since then, this issue has been a feature of our lives, this issue of white privilege. And I've heard many, many times the same thing. This is what it is. This is the kind of benefit you experience. And I've heard it so many times now, and I've seen these confrontations kind of break down, dialogues degenerate into shouting matches. And my question is, okay, I get it. I understand that there's this, that we, people with our color skin, have this privilege. I understand that we have benefits. Okay, so now what? That's my question.
That's
now
the point.
what?
I think I like that formulation. It's sort of the now what moment.
Yeah, and I was hoping that you could help me.
Well, that's where you take out your little black and white magic wand, and you wave it, and everything is hunky-dory in the garden.
And sorry, I just need to add to that. And I think the reason I say, okay, so now what is that often those conversations tend to just end with sort of, almost just a pointing finger saying, I told you you're privileged.
Yes.
Kind of rubbing it in.
Well,
and it's like we aren't getting anywhere.
Yeah. It is one of my constant frustrations, is this notion that no matter what you say, it is somehow magically used as an argument against you. The mere fact that I'm sitting here today talking to you, and the two of us are echo chambering as two whites, is bound to be used against us in some form or fashion. And one is almost powerless. But if we don't say these things, then what are we going to do?
Yeah.
So I have been trying to get to a point where we discuss more of these things on what I would regard as a reasonable and a rational level. Because I've been taken to task. I had an interview with Edwin Cameron at the Stellenbosch Woordfees, where he spoke to me about the book, and the one example that he called out was, I said that I find it akin. I was referring to the example of people saying, kill all whites or fuck white people. Both of those were prominent in the Fees Must Fall campaign at the time.
Right.
And I said, from my perspective, both of those strike me as, at the very least, powerful moral condemnations, which I can understand. From a psychological perspective, you understand that there is the need to do moral condemnation. But at a rational level, what I find particularly frustrating is the fact that it is all whites, and that it is resorting to the most unreasonable of responses, the most tribal of responses. Because you don't understand us, or you can't solve our problem, or we can't solve our problem with you, or whatever the difficulty is, we must kill you. Whether that's meant literally or not is neither here nor there.
Right.
It is a very serious moral condemnation. And my concern is, it is like a rage of a child. A child which throws itself on the floor and kicks the floor and throws its toys about because of its frustration and its hatred of the situation which it finds itself.
There's a incredibly powerful resentment there.
It is a powerful resentment which is manifested in a form which renders it congenitally incapable of resolution. It is impossible to resolve in a discussion. It is simply a venting of anger at me.
I know you're a fan of Jordan Peterson, and he talks about the kind of very, very destructive and hateful ideas that begin to take shape in the minds of young men, such as the Columbine shooters, when or any shooter in America.
That's right.
When they for whatever reason, things happen in their life, and they build up this resentment that for them, they become incredibly hateful towards society, and they almost just want to see the world burn. Kind of like the Joker and Batman. It's like they just want to see the world burn because it will validate the sense of injustice that they feel they've been a victim of.
Yeah.
And I can't help but sense that was very much a feature of the last couple of years.
Absolutely,
it's been a feature. Just wanting to see everything
this absolute anger and a manifestation of a sort of a nihilism in the mind,
right?
Which says we want the chaos. It's better to have chaos. Since we foresee no order in our own lives, we want to expand the chaos.
What comes to mind is the someone said this to me recently. It's like if you're playing a board, I'm going to get this wrong, but if you're playing a board game and you're losing, you can flip it up, you can flip the board game up, and your pieces will most probably land in more advantageous positions than they were when you're losing. So the point is that if you're on the losing end, you're most likely going to benefit from chaos. Especially if you have nothing else to lose. And I feel like that was a part of,
I suppose,
the attitude.
And where it comes from, it seems to me, I got a glimpse from when I read Ferial Hafford's book, What If There Were No White People?
Right.
Which I found a particularly depressing read, I've got to tell you. And why is because the perspective is from her colleagues, her peers,
right,
black people,
in
South Africa, who were advancing, who were actually benefiting from affirmative action, employment equity, black economic empowerment, schooling, universities. They were actually part of the privileged elite. They were the 10% at the top. And yet, despite all the strides that have been made on a governance level and an economic level to improve their lives, these people conveyed to her, and she was, funnily enough, surprised about it. That's a big irony of the book. Conveyed to her a sense of hopelessness, that they're simply never going to escape this hegemony of black capital and black power, white capital and white power. And I found that depressing. And why I find it depressing, I've just started reading, as you know, Steven Pinker's book on enlightenment, and the central message of the book is we can work this out. With reason, we can sit down and we can think of a solution. And if it takes the 2 of us or the 10 of us to sit down together and work this out, we can sit down and work out a solution. And we can then try, trial and error. What works, and carry on. That is how we got where we are. And we are relatively very, very successful compared to where we were 300 or 200 years ago when the process started.
Right. I mean, that's coming back to the point I made about, conversations ending with just kind of rubbing white privilege in and not really offering any solutions. I feel like there's definitely, I've also sensed that hopelessness there as well. There's almost an implicit sense of this will never be right, this will never come right. We're kind of doomed to be in conflict or forevermore. So all we're going to do now is just condemn you forever. It's just a sense that I get. And so coming back to my question of, okay, so now what?
How do we go?
How do we begin to pick up the pieces and what is a reasonable way of...
I personally think that, and I said this much to you last time, and to some extent that will be a contradiction. I said to you last time, I don't think in 1,000 years we will resolve this around the table. I don't believe that we're actually going to talk this thing out and resolve it. And I've seen it so many times in discussions and workshops that are aimed at achieving better race relations, that the scab is ripped off and it becomes worse. Now, I'm the last one to say that we should deny the difficulty, we should deny the problem, but I fundamentally believe that if you can change the experience of people, black people's experience of white people and white people's experience of black people, then and only then will we change our attitudes.
Right.
And I just don't see how we do that without an economic change.
So the chapter, just to remind people that this chapter in your book, the second chapter, it's titled "Let's Be Honest About White Privilege." So something that I want to add into this conversation is something that I've been wanting to express for quite some time. I feel like it's a major elephant in the room when it comes to white privilege, and it's basically this: is that I've watched. I'm a young white man. I've got young white friends. I'm part of white communities. I mean, if you want to find out what white people are thinking, I'm a relatively good person to go to. You know, I can offer you an interesting perspective, and so I've seen firsthand white people just disconnect from the debate, from the discourse, from the problem, because there's so much condemnation that even I know someone who's had who suffered quite a serious nervous breakdown because of Roads Must Fall, and the kind of incredibly volatile racial conflict that occurred and unfolded. And so my point is this: is that, look, it's not an ideal situation, but this is the truth that white people and young white people, I see it all the time. They try to connect. Okay, cool. Okay, what are the problems? Oh no. We mustn't. We are responsible for all these problems. You hate us. Okay, we get it. Well, cool. I'm going to go to Clifton. See you later. And I know that's I'm kind of making light of it in a way, but I see it all the time. Young white folks, they're privileged, and all they do is they retreat into the privilege. Because where else do you go? I'm not going to go to Australia. I'm not going to go anywhere else. This is what
and of course that tends to exacerbate the problem, because it does emphasize the privilege. It does emphasize the divide. And
by the way, I just want to make this point that it's not like I want that. It's and I'm not saying that this is the case for me only. I'm saying I'm seeing this across the board. Young white folks kind of whether they will admit to it or not is another thing. But yeah, I can see it in their behavior, their lifestyles. This kind of removal from.
Yeah, look, it is a reality. As I say, I don't think my approach to solving problems at a national level is not one which deals with the individual psychology. I don't think I'm in a position to do that. I don't have the skills, and I don't believe fundamentally that you can actually talk individuals through and make them better citizens. I think people. You must appeal to the better angels of people's natures by setting structures and incentives in place where it becomes easier.
Right.
And it will become easier. I believe, and I cited examples, and we saw one this weekend. We're talking on the day after the historic victory of the Springboks against England, where we were for the first time led by a black captain, and two of the stars in the team, the two wingers, were black players who I think generally are accepted as star players. They're good enough, and everybody embraced the idea that these guys. And I'm talking. I follow rugby groups on Facebook, and people were delighted about the performance.
Awesome. Yeah.
And black and white, it doesn't matter. Right. And I'm saying there's just a little glimpse of an experience of what makes people feel better about each other. Far, far more powerful than anything we can do in a workshop and a seminar in a psychology consulting room, and whatever the case might be. It just will not work. In fact, that will make it worse. And I think in that category, I must include Facebook chat rooms and that sort of thing. Those forums where people have a go at each other. They make it worse. They don't make it better.
They make it a lot worse.
And I believe that we can. People are incredibly generous.
Yeah.
When they see light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
And the problem is, as we've identified, black people, for a large part, see no light at the end of the tunnel.
Right.
And we've got to give that opportunity. And that is a structural thing. It's a landscape. I think that will change.
I think one of the big challenges that we face with this issue of dealing with white privilege is that I often find people equate white privilege with guilt, and that's something that I personally disagree with. I'm happy to admit that I am privileged, but I have thought about this a great deal.
Yeah.
There's no way that I was born in 1992. There's no way that I'm possibly guilty in the legal sense, or any sense, guilty for anything that happened before I was born. Yeah. Even before, you could argue before I was like 13. And when I say that, I'm not trying to undermine the severity of the situation, or I'm not trying to make it seem like everything's rosy. I'm just saying let's just be real here about the problems. I can't take on guilt. I'm not.
Well, it's the same as that. The point I made with kill all whites, because the fundamental assumption, logically underlying the statement, or a statement such as that, is you are all to blame. You are all guilty, and the only basis on which you can be guilty is because you're white.
Right.
You are linked in because you know, it's this archaic religious notion of the sins of the fathers.
Right.
You are tainted with the sins of your fathers and your fathers before them. Yeah. And I think that is just not rational. So as a basis for addressing the problem, I think it's terribly unfair. You're on slightly firmer ground if you say, well, you benefit.
Yeah.
Then I think you are in fact on reasonably firm ground. What you do as a result of that, of course, is a different question. And that is where the two arguments must come in. The first is, can we justify a solution which is fundamentally based on freedom of choice, from a moral point of view? Is that the most moral way? And can we justify it from a utilitarian point of view? In other words, will it work? Will it actually work? And I think those two questions can be separated. And I've lately come to the realization that you can actually look at both of those and separate them out. And it seems to me that ultimately the difficulty with social engineering, which is really what all these measures are, which are in place, have this nasty habit of becoming an endless treadmill.
Yeah, exactly. And
what I have in mind is the fact that as we sit here, we will never ever be able to say what the end line will look like. What will it look like that day when we say, you know what, we have put in these measures of redress and we've now achieved what we set out to do. Finally, redress has been done, and whatever the test is, the races are now materially equal.
Right.
Everybody has the same outcome. That is impossible. It will never ever happen. The other day I thought about just the United States, for example, but it happens here too. You know that disproportionately, by far, the greatest success story in academic life in the United States, and I don't think this is a secret, is people from Oriental countries, Chinese mostly.
Yeah.
Chinese and Koreans
They
and
dominate.
Japanese
They just
completely dominate. Now, these are people who came to the United States not as privileged whites or privileged Chinese. They were ordinary people. Some of them were very poor people. For reasons whatever they were.
right. Right.
Historical, genetic IQ, or cultural benefits, or a habit of studying hard, or
I mean, I've heard
tiger moms.
I've heard stories of from Asian Americans talking about how their parents, came and worked as cashiers in restaurants, cashiers in petrol stations, and then they go to night school, and they'd save up for their children's college, and hard stories of real struggle.
Yes.
But what seems to have been driving these people is an incredibly potent work ethic.
That's right.
And this is, for me, something I'd like us to talk about at some stage in this conversation.
We'll look at that.
Are the differences in ethics and.
That's the one story, and the point I'm simply making there is that nobody has ever thought. In fact, if anything, affirmative action operates against that. What should really be regarded as a previously disadvantaged group.
Right.
And the other one, which is equally as potent an example, is the Jews in America. On many fronts now a hated group, but disproportionate number of winners of Nobel Prizes, for example, of particularly top positions in academia, in boards of companies, and so on. Powerfully successful people, disproportionate to their numbers.
Yeah.
Now, does that mean they're now a privileged group, and I, as a white person, if I live there, or same applies to some extent in South Africa,
right,
should I now feel, no, we now have to have some demographic representation for Jewish people proportionate to their numbers?
Right.
No, it's absolutely ridiculous. You will never ever be able to determine, and that's the point I'm making, you will never get to that point where the line is drawn in the sand, where you can say, thank goodness, tonight we can go to bed in the firm knowledge that we have succeeded.
Yeah, it's all done, guys. Well done.
And you know what? The point I'm making is not that the old story of a woman's work is never done. That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that means the goalpost will forever be shifting.
Yeah.
You will never ever get it. Will be like the traveler in the desert with a mirage of the oasis. We will never get to the oasis, which will mean that whoever is in charge of that expedition through the desert is in a position to say, no, you just have to march another 10 miles.
Yeah.
Tomorrow we will get to water. We just have to march another 10 miles. And that, in a nutshell, is the definition of tyranny.
Yeah.
Because tyranny is the exercise of power in an arbitrary fashion. One where you don't know. As a lawyer, one of the most fundamental things that we try and do is to test laws to the rule of law, which says one of the principles is you must know what you're supposed to do in order to comply. And I think it's a fair question. A fair question will arise at some point in time where people whose freedom is invaded in this way, and I'm talking about the white people for the most part, are going to say, how much more do we have to travel through this desert in order to get to the promised land?
Yeah.
If we just tell us, most people are quite happy to comply.
Yeah.
Most people in this country most companies are actually complying with employment equity.
Yeah, it's like, what do we have to do?
Must
I pay a tax?
Let's just do it. But the point is, we know as we sit here that point will never be reached. We will never reach satisfaction.
And there'll always be disgruntled people, angry and wanting someone to point a finger at and blame.
And the other thing that we mustn't forget is that amongst your beneficiaries, you haven't even begun to see the degree of conflict that is possible there, because at the moment there is huge resentment amongst black people because some are benefited at the expense of others.
Right.
And that will continue. So so what happens is that the government then tries to put in more draconian measures in place. And you can see it in the history. Our country illustrates this perfectly. We started off with labor law. It was thought that if you have labor law and you have some minimum wages, you can improve the lives of black people. That's where it started. It was a political thing to benefit black workers. And then came affirmative action in the form of employment equity. Then came black empowerment. And none of those things worked. They all failed. Because the unemployment went up. Unintended consequences proliferated. And when the unemployment went up, they suddenly said, all right, now we're going to have welfare grants, social grants.
Yeah.
And we now reach the point, as we discussed earlier, where 17 million people are getting grants and 16 million are employed. So more people are receiving grants than are employed. Now that is not working. Now what do we do? And you know what we are doing now, as we're debating whether land should be confiscated.
Yeah.
So the point I'm making is
that it's quite a depressing picture.
It's depressing, but I'm making a moral point here, and that is that quite apart from whether this works or not, it is doomed not to work because of this shifting goalpost.
Yeah.
And it is doomed, secondly, because the government has embarked on this process, it is doomed to lead to ever more draconian measures.
And my great something that I'm becoming increasingly concerned about, the more I learn about these issues and the more I learn about the significance of government interference. I mean, for many, many years, the idea of government interference, it didn't really strike a chord. But the more reading I've done into history, and the more that I've come to appreciate freedom, which is a huge part of your book, the more I'm realizing just how dangerous, and also not just regardless of danger, how problematic it is in terms of the development of the human spirit. It's like I was having a conversation with a friend over breakfast today, and I said to him, I was telling him about what we were going to talk about, and I said to him, imagine you have a child, and you're wanting them to grow up, but you keep on enabling them, and you never get them to take responsibility for themselves. And so you're both locked in this, like Jordan Peterson talks about the classic story of Hansel and Gretel and the witch feeding the kids, fattening them up to eat them, and this archetypal story of the parent never letting the child go, and they're both trapped in this terribly destructive relationship, and neither of them know why they're so unhappy. And I feel like there's something there.
Yes.
It's almost like South Africa is the witch kind of fattening up the child, getting ready to eat them. I mean, sorry, it's getting very archetypal. But
no. But I understand. Yeah. I understand the point, and the point is that the two kinds of unhappiness in that story, and the one is the unhappiness of the indignity.
Yes.
On the one side, the indignity of an existence where you don't have the pride of paying your way,
and of agency, of self-determination.
Self-determination, which I think it's fundamental. It's when you do constitutional law, as we all do as lawyers, the core value, besides freedom, is dignity. And dignity has the idea at its heart of a person's right or ability to determine his own destination through action. It is the most fundamental thing that we have learned to do as human beings.
And I think that I would argue that's a major feature of white privilege, is that we get to enjoy a kind of a level
Agency.
of agency and self-determination that I would argue, as someone who's become slightly more conservative in their thinking, I would argue that the more I read, it seems like the people more on the left almost, without knowing it, they're unwittingly stealing that away from black people.
Absolutely.
Because they're not. There's this idea that we need to save you. We need to give you all these helping hands. You can't do it on your own. And the irony is, the more conservative thinkers like, look, my approach might sound harsher, but actually it's because I respect you and I think that you're capable of doing this yourself. I mean, what do you...
I had this funny dilemma that I had to confront myself about the question, is this, and it is this, is it not terribly paternalistic?
Yeah.
And the question the way that I resolved it was by saying, what is more paternalistic? Saying to people, you must do this for yourself, for yourselves, or saying to people, don't worry, the state will look after you. And I think the latter is far more. Then you treat someone like a child.
Especially if that happens for years, even decades. Eventually, people completely lose sight. They lose touch with personal responsibility. It's like the concept disappears to them completely, and that's what, and I can't help but think that that's what's going on in South Africa. There seems to be a sort of this very disturbing disconnect between certain portions of the population and personal responsibility. Now, and something I would want to add is that it's like I think we've demonstrated this already in the discussion. We are not unaware of the problems. It's not like we are in denial of the privilege that we enjoy, but I think that there's and it's not like I'm personally saying that there should be no government support, but I'm simply trying to get more people to think more seriously about the giant elephant in the room, which is the issue of personal responsibility and ethics and values, traditions.
I've been trying to think of analogies. There's a very hackneyed one which has some merit, and that is the old story of the guy saying, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you give him a fishing rod, you teach him to fish.
Right.
And now what you make him self-sufficient. Now that's a very simplified economic model, but it has some merit, because what it helps with is that it brings to mind the idea that the only way you can make it in life is by participating. An example, come back to the sports metaphor. The sports participant is injured. When he gets back into the sporting arena, he doesn't want the officials or the referees to say to him, listen, you can get 10 yards advantage because we know that you've got this ankle or this leg. He wants to, he knows, I've got to practice harder. I'm behind now.
Yeah.
There's no way, the only way he will ever compete is by overcoming the injury. And the same with the fisherman. The only way you will ever learn to fish is actually to go there and have the heartbreak of failing until you get it right. And it sounds easy because, white privilege, you've got the schooling and so on. Yes, I've got the schooling and I've got the benefits. And the other guy doesn't. that means he's got to try harder than I did.
Yeah.
Let's face the facts. Let's be honest about white privilege.
Yeah.
I had a benefit.
Yeah.
You didn't. Now what are you going to do about it?
What I think is incredible is that there's almost there's a I can't help but think of that, you know, the idea of it with the ostrich with its head in the sand. When you talk about that example, because one thing I've thought of before is, you know, let's imagine an alternative situation where, let's say it's 1994, Mandela becomes president, and for some bizarre reason, all the whites pick up and go to Europe. The sad irony is that in 2018 we'd all be so much wealthier. We'd be in much more advanced, developed worlds and societies. So the point I'm trying to make is that there is this awful truth that life's like you've been dealt a bad hand, and it's not trying to rub it in. It's just trying to say, like, denying that is not going to get anyone anywhere, and there is a great degree of strength and fortitude that one needs to draw on to deal with these problems, because, like you said, you know, you're privileged, so it's just you got to work a bit harder. You've got to work. You know, we are privileged, so because
I can't make that. I can't make that jump. There's nothing I can do.
Yeah.
And that is maybe the harsh reality. There's absolutely nothing I can do from my side to make that
to close the
jump.
Gap. Yeah.
I can't make that jump for you. What I can do is I can arguably give money for someone to go to school.
Yeah.
I can help someone go to school, and I think it's fair. Personally, I think I make that concession that we should, as taxpayers, fund education, and education should be improved.
Right.
And I personally think the private sector should provide that state-funded education. But we already do that. It should have happened long ago. That it actually started bridging the gap. But the only person who can bridge that gap is that learner who sits in school.
Yeah.
And has to go through the steps.
Right.
And get the degree, and nobody else can do that. And I find that very, very frustrating. And as a parent, I can just say to you that I have had huge fights with, and you don't talk to parents about child rearing, right? It's a taboo topic. So we learned very quickly early on not to. But I learned that the more you challenge a child, the more you throw them in at the deep end, the easier it becomes after a while.
Yeah.
It's tough, but you only learn to live life by living it.
Something else that I'd like to add was this really incredible realization, and such a potent. It was such a potent experience of going to Japan, and this was 2015, and this is during Fees Must Fall, sort of Roads Must Fall time. And you go to Japan, and it's like you step 200 years into the future, 200 years into the future. And it's such an advanced society. I mean, if you want to talk about privileged, let's talk about the Japanese, because they are just like universes ahead of us, you know. And the overwhelming feeling I had was that none of them care. They're not waiting around for us to catch up. And that, I think, should be quite a sobering fact for people. And it's the same in Japan and European countries and America and any of the developed nations of the world. They're not waiting around for us to get our act together.
Yeah.
So it's like all this time that we spend condemning each other and going on and on and on about how terrible history was. Just go to Japan. It's striking. No one cares. And I don't mean this in a nasty way. They are just building the most incredible future for themselves.
And they have their own problems to attend to.
And they have their own problems. And
their problems lie at a slightly different level, but they still have to pay attention every day and every hour of the day.
But the overwhelming feeling I got when I was there was that they're only aimed one direction. It's to the future. And in South Africa, there's just this, again, and it's not, I don't want to undermine the situation. I understand the severity of the situation that we're in and why it's happened and all that. But it's just it's sort of like come on guys, let's pull ourselves together type of sentiment.
Well, you touched on the tough topic of work ethic earlier on. Now, far from condemning cultures, because every culture, I believe, has advantages. And I'm not saying this is a palliative. Let's just start with that. Cultures are enormously different. I tell my story of education, of Gordon Brown when he was Minister of Foreign Affairs, or whatever they call it in Britain. And he visited this Chinese school, and they all had to ask him questions, like interview him for the school magazine. And the one chap, he said to him, so what would the minister have wanted to be if you weren't a minister of state? And he was not a very socially skilled person, old Gordon Brown, and he gave this slight uncomfortable chuckle. He says, no, I wanted to be a soccer player. And there was this collective gasp that went around the room. And the Chinese kids and teachers, according to the journalist who wrote the story, you could see their minds ticking over. We quite admire the British Empire, but why would a person who is serious about his life want to do a thing like hacking a ball around when he could actually decide the financial future of his country? And they simply couldn't understand that.
Wow.
And that's a demonstration of the focus. And then, of course, he asked, he said, I'm going to turn the tables. You tell me what you want to become. And, of course, the one said, I want to become an engineer. And the other one wants to be an entrepreneur. And the other one wants to be a rocket scientist.
Right.
And the journalist's response at the end was just to say, of course.
Yeah.
It's that there is something like that. There's a cultural thing.
Right.
But I think it's weak to resort to culture as the explanation. Culture plays a role, but culture ultimately comes through years and years of exposure to certain incentives and so on. And we can't change a culture overnight. We can't change people's minds fundamentally.
Right.
That's why, just like we can't make people non-racist, I don't think you can make people suddenly turn into workaholics driven by the ethic of the result and so on.
Right.
But what we are doing in this country is we're going the other way. We're creating the incentives and the structures to go exactly in the other direction.
The other direction, you mean?
The non-work ethic direction, the lazy direction, the one which says, I'm not responsible for my own income, my own profits, my own results, my own school outcomes, and so on.
So, Frans, before we end this, maybe this is a good time to just explore briefly the issue of the culture of victimhood.
Yeah.
That is, I think, very prevalent in South Africa, and also maybe you could touch on the problem that identity politics presents to us. Yeah, so let's start with this victimhood culture.
Yeah, the victimhood culture, I think, is normally captured in my mind in the form of a dialogue. It is this dialogue which has this. We referred to it earlier on. This circular reasoning process which ends up where you can't win the argument. If you oppose the identity politics person, you lose the argument no matter what you say.
Right.
So, for example, if you say, how can we help? That is called out as insulting because you are, as a white person, presuming that you must solve problems for black people. Right. Alternatively, if you say, what is the problem? You say, well, if you don't understand the problem, you shouldn't even ask the question.
Yeah, I mean, I've firsthand experienced situations where people say, I don't want to explain to you. Go read about it. And my response to that is, I remember someone even said, go Google it. You have the internet, go Google. And there's a famous Canadian professor. His name's Marshall McLuhan, or maybe Charles McLuhan. I think it's Marshall McLuhan. Might get that name wrong, but he said, he has this beautiful quote. It goes, "The medium is the message," and I love this quote because for me it sums up the kind of problem that I have with this. Go read a book or go read it. Is that what people don't realize is that the medium is the message. So if you want me to get the message from a cold book where there's no humanity, no individual, it's just it's a book. It's like then that's what the message will be. Yeah. Or you can tell me what your story. I mean, that's another thing I think to myself is people say go read a book, and I think to myself, did you write a book about your life? And that's where this is a great lead into identity politics, because this is the fundamental. This is for me where we miss each other. So I'm saying to you as an individual, I want to hear your story.
Yes.
And what they are saying is white people asking black people about their history,
about black people's history,
and so they say go read a book about our history. And my thinking is, but I don't want to read about black people's history. I want to
hear what your problem is.
I want to hear what you as an individual experience.
Yeah.
Because how else do we begin to understand each other?
Yeah, Greg, what I should say to you is, and this is a little ray of sunshine, a little ray of hope that I do have, and that is I've been becoming acquainted with, and I've been starting to build up a network of black young people who think in the way we are now discussing, you and I discussing our point of view. To them, this is anathema. They're still a minority, but they feel we are responsible. We must resolve our problem. We must take responsibility, and they understand that the individual is ultimately what matters. And and the good news is that there are more and more of those. And I think, in fact, what we should do is we should, not because they are black, but perhaps precisely for that reason. Unfortunately, this is how we work in this country. That we can demonstrate a kind of thinking that is there. It is not all hopeless, and I also think that is one of the thin ends of the wedge into this problem is to get those networks expanded.
And this is something that I'm seeing online. You see, I feel like the beauty of the internet is that it allows these kinds of discussions to emerge, and to be, and then they can be accessed by people. But it's very but it's very difficult for these conversations to exist, to take place publicly. And I've seen these kinds of dialogues try to emerge and then break down terribly. And what happens is that people. People get very angry and it becomes very emotional, and it can be very disheartening if you're trying to find a solution, to constantly experience that. But I find one thing online, one of the beautiful things about the online environment, particularly with YouTube, is that if there's a video with people getting emotional and being unreasonable, people very quickly see through it. And that's why that's at least one of the reasons why I'm quite hopeful is that I think there's something happening. There's the emergence of conversations like these and like the one we're having now. And I mean, do you sense that as well? Or
yes, I think there's room for a discussion, and I think what we find at the moment is there's quite a powerful formulation of a thinking pattern, which is, if I may use the terribly abused term, counter-revolutionary, in terms of it is giving people a voice who have been unmeasurably frustrated by being deplatformed, by being treated with irrational responses and so on, and where identity becomes the weapon of choice.
Right.
Where every argument is somehow cast in a statement about, but you are black, or you are white, or you are privileged, or you are rich.
Yeah.
And your group becomes the judge of the words you say.
I mean, I had an experience firsthand where I was at an event and this young 18-year-old girl spoke at length, like went on a real rant, just shouting at all the white folks in the room, really kind of going at us, you know. I don't want to say us, kind of going at the group of the white people. And afterwards I went up to her and I said, could I give a moment to talk? And she said, not that it's not like I ever listened to white men, but, you know, and she said this to me.
So as a starting point,
so that's how we began the conversation, and she was obviously looking at me with not trying to hide her disdain for me at all. She was looking at me with this as if I'd sort of murdered a whole family, you know.
And the only things she knew about you was your gender and your skin color.
Yeah, and
she knew nothing more.
Yeah, and
that was enough.
Yeah. And she was really filled with anger and filled with real disdain for me, and pretty much every white person there that evening. And I just remember thinking, look, like I get it, I understand why you're angry, but you are not changing my mind at all. You are not making, you're not winning me over to your side at all. I mean. And this is where I think what I would want to say to younger people, particularly if you're heading into varsity now, is, you know, for heaven's sake, let's be realistic about our goal. Like, if your goal is chaos, then keep doing that kind of thing. But if we want to have do you think that there is emotion? There's more emotion on the other side of the argument, because it's something which I sense. I sense that it's really difficult. Yeah. And I'm talking about people who are normally intelligent people and otherwise cool and calm and collected. But you would argue either on the gender front or on the race front. And the vitriol is far more worse than anything I can ever conceive of on my side. Yeah.
I have my frustrations, but they are intellectual frustrations. They're an inability to communicate. And an inability to grasp why. Yeah. But I find there's an anger.
And you see, to me, the danger of identity politics as well is that, you know, my question is, well, at what point do you begin to make progress? Because if you're not willing to listen and engage with individuals, like there is no head of white people. Like, even the idea of a white community is a bizarre thing, because it's not like we get together and have community club meetings and we don't there's no plan for white. You know,
we shall discriminate in the following ways this week.
That doesn't happen, for anyone wondering. You know, and I think that's what's so sad is that there's so many opportunities for individuals to engage and connect with each other. And they're not being capitalized on.
No, I think that's important. It should not be overestimated either. But these discussions, you know, I suppose what I'm saying is, let's see if we can start a network of discussions. They may not be the end result of what, you know. It may not bring about the result that we want in its own. Yeah, but it can be a very powerful instrument. Yeah,
I mean, I guess with the advent of cell phones, I'm realizing it's becoming increasingly important to be aware to film the discussions that take place, and that's something that I've realized the Americans have caught on to very well. Is they seem to be on university campuses. People tend to be quite good at filming things, and as far as I know, people don't do it as much here. There's not as, for example, I haven't seen much footage of Rhodes Must Fall confrontations or whatever, or any of the discussions, the heated debates, and I know there were plenty of them. And it would be amazing to be able to, if people were started to film more, so that we could discuss rationally what is actually unfolding. And sorry, I'm talking about this on a very from from a student's perspective, a younger person's perspective.
But those perspectives somehow matter.
Yeah.
You guys are going to run, well, your generation is going to run the country one of these days.
Frans, is there anything else that you'd like to add? I think one thing that I did want to talk about briefly before we wrap up is, and it kind of builds on the issue of victimhood and issues of victimhood and identity politics. It's just the culture of outrage, this culture of outrage that we deal with. I mean, for example, there was a story recently about Checkers on Mother's Day. I don't know if you heard this. So there was a display, and it said, make your Mother's Day or something, and then it was just cleaning products, right? And this caused an outrage on social media, and everyone took photos of it and posted on it, and now this is outrageous.
Stereotyping
and then,
mother.
Yeah, and then Checkers revealed to everyone. They posted a picture later in the day saying, or later in the morning, whatever it was, saying, "Look, everyone, please relax. We were in the process of moving a display. We realized it wasn't appropriate, but this is actually what the display looks like." And then they show you a picture of what it looks like now, and it's full of Mother's Day gifts. Now
I didn't have drills and hammers and saws.
But the interesting thing is, I thought it just showed how bizarre and absurd this culture of outrage is, because instead of people going to the manager, if you genuinely cared about the display, in theory you'd go to the manager and you'd say, "Hi, my name's Peter, whatever, and I'm a bit concerned about the display, and I just thought I'd point it out." But what people do is they take a picture of it. They haven't talked to the manager. They don't know what's going on, and then they just send it out, and they just express this outrage. And what's so upsetting to me is that I feel there's a lot of narcissism, I think, and virtue signaling going on. It's like, look at me, I'm a good person.
Yeah,
I've recognized an injustice, and I want attention now because I'm such a good person, and I've exposed the injustice of the world.
Well,
and then everyone kind of just feverishly goes a bit crazy.
The same thing was illustrated by the
Ashwin
Willemse
Willemse thing. It was nuts.
It took about a week before there was any significant fact known, other than the fact that Ashwin was coloured. He walked off the set and said the other two were...
And even the sports minister came out.
And the other two were whites, and they had played rugby in the apartheid era. That was more or less what was known.
Yeah.
And eventually, we still don't have any... And my first response was, well, I have no idea what's going on here, so can I reserve my judgment? Let's find out what the facts are. There were even people who took me to task for that, who said to me, no, but you can see the way they're talking to him.
I mean, it's so...
Really, you can see they were laughing.
Yeah.
And really I was thinking to myself, what video footage have you been watching? I mean, people laugh on TV all the time.
Also, people laugh awkwardly. People laugh when they're... I mean, you're on live television.
What on earth? Let's get the facts. And I was actually taken to task by people who had already picked sides.
Yeah, no, there was a guy, there's a YouTuber, his name's Ronaldo Goos, and I admire him. He's quite a brave guy. He makes videos about all sorts of issues in South Africa. And he made a video saying exactly that. He said, look, guys, this Ashwin Willemse things happened, but we don't know anything. That's pretty much all his video was about, right? And the hate that he made a video just about the hate that he then received. People just went for the jugular. They took him to task and really rubbed it in how much they said you white, you racist, you this, you that, and he was just saying, guys, I haven't said anything, but I'm just saying that we don't know the full story. This brings up something that I one last thing. I keep on saying one last thing. I've recently come across this fascinating psychological, could you say, phenomenon or aspect of psychology known as selective attention. And there's a famous experiment done where people are made to watch a video, and there are people dancing, throwing basketballs to each other in white shirts, and people dancing in people throwing basketballs to each other in black shirts, and you have to count how many times the ball gets thrown between the people in white shirts. So they play the video and you count, and I think it's like 15. And then at the end of the video, he says, "Okay, how many times did they throw the ball?" And you say 15, and he says, "Cool, that was correct. Did you notice the gorilla in the walk across the screen?" And they say, "What gorilla?" And then they play back the video, and lo and behold, there's a gorilla.
Yeah.
And it blows people's minds. And I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking about why it's relevant to South Africa. And it dawned on me that essentially what's happening with people who are ideologically possessed by victimhood or by identity politics, essentially what they're doing is their attention is very selective, and they're only counting the number of racist incidents that they experience. And so what happens is the gorillas on the screen, which are all the good happening in the world, they completely miss out on all that good and all the potential for change and solutions, and because their attention is solely focused on this terrible thing that they're fixated on. Yeah. And the more I thought about it, I've just realized, like, I think that's a real thing.
Steven Pinker talks about the availability heuristic.
Yeah, exactly.
The fact that if you ask the ordinary person out there, what's the state of crime? You can pick your problem.
Yeah.
What's the state of crime in the world? No, it's getting worse. What is the state of health in the world? Definitely getting worse. Inequality, poverty, any one of those. They would be wrong on all of them. And the reason is they rely on the stories in the newspapers. In the newspapers, he fairly makes the point, don't report anything but bad news.
Yeah.
You can't say, we went to Bosnia today and a war did not break out.
Yeah.
That's not news.
Well, there's no malaria today in Kenya.
There's no malaria in Kenya. So what you have is people pay attention to the crisis and then translate that into an assumption that it must mean that things are getting worse and that things are actually very bad.
Yes.
And this is also true on another level. I would like to end off with this, and that is simply by saying the fact that these things happen and are argued on social media, we must remind ourselves that those spats are not the real world.
Totally.
The real world, I still believe, if you go across the road to the supermarket or to the coffee shop, you will find only benevolence amongst the races. People work together, people interact, most people are friendly. You joke with them, they joke with you. I refuse to believe that they nurture racial hatred in their minds. I refuse to believe it because I don't experience that. So that's the other side of the coin, and I still think that's 99% of what happens in the real world.
Frans, I agree with you 100%, and I think that's a fantastic point to end on. And hopefully that's something that people take away from this, that what we experience should be what we think, not the other way around. We shouldn't impose our ideologies and our thoughts onto our experiences. And this is something I really would love to see more in younger people who are, particularly in the early 20s, susceptible to ideologies and radical thinking. Anyways, thanks so much for another great discussion, Frans, and for taking the time to help people understand your book more, and in particular this issue of white privilege.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks to you.
I just want to end off by just reminding people that Frans's book is called South Africa Can Work, and you can just Google it. It's available to buy. It's a brilliant read and a very, very sobering look at the problems that we face and the solutions that we should be exploring if we want to become a winning nation. Cool. Thanks, Frans.
Thanks.